This orca cried and whined for her pod to come get her when she found herself beached on sharp rocks. Her family couldn't help her, but what rescuers did is incredible. The last place you would expect to see an orca is on dry land. But that's exactly what Eric Keane found when he went to investigate strange sounds he heard while sailing the seas around British Columbia early one July morning in 2015. Eric, a whale researcher, was on his vessel, the Bangarang, conducting a study on fin whales in the area when he heard mournful cries from a small outcropping of jagged stone on the shore of Andrew Rocks. A young orca was in obvious distress, wedged between sharp rocks and increasingly out of the water. According to Save Our Seas, Janie and Hermann Meuter, around 7:30 a.m., Eric called the local environmental group Whale Point to tell them what he had found. From Eric's description, the orca experts realized what must have happened. Orca pods in that area would often collaborate to hunt seals for food, with some orcas chasing the seals toward the shore, while others patiently waited to spring the trap. This young female orca must have miscalculated her position, and as the tide went out, she found herself in shallower and shallower water until there was no way to extricate herself from where she lay, wedged between the rocks. She was bellowing for help, obviously scared and probably in pain, when Eric fortunately sailed nearby. Eric was well known to Janie and Hermann, often working closely with them on their research. They were traveling back from Hartley Bay toward their base when he alerted them to the young orca's plight. Janie and Hermann knew that time was of the essence and that they would need all the help they could get. So as they raced north to join Eric in Squally Channel, they also contacted Gitgot Guardians at Hartley Bay and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, DFO, both marine organizations, to alert them to the young orca's desperate situation. Meanwhile, Eric and his crew approached the orca to see if they could help her get off the rocks. They did not get too close at first, to avoid startling her and causing her to hurt herself while possibly trying to get away. The reality was that if they had tried to lift her off the rocks or pull her, they would have injured her badly, as the rocks were covered in barnacles, which could have cut her skin. As it was, she was bleeding a little from her pectoral area and her tail. Upon the arrival of Janie and Hermann, Eric learned that John Ford and Paul Cottrell of DFO had given guidance over a satellite phone to keep the orca cool and wet until the tide rose again, at which time she would be able to free herself. The tide, however, would not rise again for another 8 hours, so the marathon rescue began. When they first approached her, the orca was obviously anxious about what their intentions might be. To be trapped, in discomfort, and surrounded by humans must have been pretty scary for a young killer whale. Her breathing was quick and shallow, and gravity was clearly making it harder for her. Eric ingeniously put together a makeshift water pump from a hose and some duct tape and went to the backside of the island, where he worked the pump for Hermann, who used the hose to soak the orca with cooling seawater. All the rescuers soaked sheets in seawater and placed them gently along the length of the orca's body. As they worked, they noticed that the orca's cries were quieting down, and her breathing was becoming calmer. It seemed the humans had won the orca's trust, as they were the ones comforting her while her family could only stay in the waters nearby, calling to her. The rescuers took turns pumping seawater over the young orca and replacing the sheets covering her with freshly sea-dipped cooler ones. They noticed that the orca calf's dorsal fin was getting dry, so they used a pillowcase from Eric's boat, wet with seawater, to cover the fin. All morning, the weather had fortunately been gray and overcast. However, as the sun rose to its zenith at noon, the cloud cover dispersed, and the heat of the day began in earnest. Everyone worked tirelessly to keep the orca cool and wet, working in shifts. The humans carefully took care of the orca as if she had a fever, replacing the drier, warmer coverings for cooler, wetter ones, and continuously dousing her with seawater from the pump to ensure she wouldn't dry out from the heat of the sun. The rescuers couldn't help but think how much worse things could have been for the young orca had Eric not heard her cries. Until this point, the rescuers hadn't placed anything over the orca's head, as they didn't want her to panic from suddenly losing her sight. However, the fierceness of the sun made it absolutely necessary to protect the orca's delicate skin from the heat and dryness. Janie described how she watched one of the teams slowly approach the orca and delicately place a wet, cool sheet over her head, taking great care not to cover her blowhole. This orca's youth and relatively small size worked in her favor, At only 9 years old and around 7,000 pounds, she was roughly the weight of an average hippopotamus or 7 cows. A fully grown male orca can weigh up to 16,000 pounds, and had this beached orca been older and bigger, the pressure on her lungs would have been greater, and she may not have survived until the next tide. Just as the water pump broke, there was no fixing it. No matter how much duct tape Eric used, this could have been a devastating blow. But just at that moment, the sea began to rise again. After 9 exhausting hours, the tide had risen sufficiently for the rescuers to begin the process of setting the young orca free. They removed the sheets from her body and the pillowcase from her dorsal fin. The time had come for the orca to do what only she could do: swim out of her rocky prison. The rescuers didn't want to startle her into trying too soon and injuring herself more, so they walked away and climbed onto a nearby cliff to watch and wait. All of them silently wished her strength and the ability to free herself. The water level slowly crept up the orca's body until it covered her. As this happened, she began to cry out again, but this time the vocalization seemed different. Perhaps it was excitement at the possibility of release. Yet, she continued to lie there, occasionally lifting her tail but making no attempt to swim. The rescuers were becoming worried. They wondered if something was wrong. Perhaps she was more badly injured than they had thought. Maybe she was too drained from her long ordeal to make this one last gargantuan push to escape. They soon realized they just needed to trust the orca's instincts. By moving her tail, she was testing the water's depth. When she knew it was safe, she suddenly struck out with 2 huge thrusts. Free of the rocks, she sped through the sea. From their vantage points, the human rescuers cheered in exhilaration and relief. They had done it. After more than 9 hours of hard work and care, they had managed to keep the young orca alive until she could return to her pod. Eric had placed a hydrophone into the water and was able to play the rescue as the orca's song as she vocalized over and over, calling for a response from her family. For a while, her voice was the only one. Eric and his fellow miracle workers experienced a moment of concern and doubt. Where was the young orca's pod? Had they given up on her after such a very long time on land? Had they sadly swam away to mourn her loss? As faint replies to the rescued orca's cries started to become audible from some distance away, a wave of relief washed over the waiting listeners. The young female evidently heard her family's replies too, as she swam in the direction of their transient calls, speeding away in joy and the thrill of release. The team of human rescuers stood together in their shared emotions. They were feeling so proud and overwhelmed by what they had managed to do together. Every one of them had given their all. They sighed with relief, knew that what they had experienced that day would stay with them all for as long as they lived. If you love this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.